few years ago, I really thought I was hot stuff and getting to know my way around UFOs in the Bible. It's a bookstore downtown, and I've been here for a few years. I got forwarded a PDF of Mike Heiser's book, The Facade, and I read it in 2 days on a computer screen because I could not. I went to work and I would fall asleep. Otherwise, I would eat with one hand and turn the pages or scroll the screen with the other. And I am pleased to introduce the man whose shoes I am not worthy to tie. And I realize I've never had the honor of introducing you as Dr. Michael S. Heiser.
You know, I really don't get like $1 every time somebody mentions doctor. Well, this too shall pass. I don't know if you've gotten it yet, but you know, as Guy has said before, one of the attempts here is to bring together people that he, as the organizer, feels pretty strongly are serious researchers in ufology and serious researchers in biblical and ancient studies. And if you haven't quite figured out why the mix sort of works for us and for him, and I'll include myself in his group as a Christian, should have been illustrated pretty well with Dave Flynn's talk. The reason we think that what is happening to people as they bear witness to things that happen in their lives that are very strange, the reason we attach reality to it, specifically view it as a spiritual reality and a spiritual force, which is not a denial of the physical. The reason we are interested and the reason that we think it's real and worth investigating is because, quite frankly, and I'm hoping that you could tell this from Dave's talk, the ancient texts, specifically the Bible, have had this pegged for a really long time. What we think of all this stuff is that the most coherent, cohesive understanding of everything that's going on both now in technological 21st century garb, as it were, and what has happened and is testified to in antiquity, both in texts and in symbols. The only thing that makes all of that cohere together, or the thing that makes it cohere together the best, we think, is the Judeo-Christian worldview. We're very free to go beyond the Bible. You've heard Enoch quoted here a lot, and I'll introduce you to some other texts in this session. But we think that there is a reason why it coheres, and that is because it is ultimately a spiritual phenomenon that can take very literal, very physical, very real form. And we think that it just makes good sense. It provides some coherence if you can sort of read between the lines in some places and understand the symbology. And ultimately, if you believe in something called a non-physical reality. Now, I realize some of you have come here, and you are essentially, in my mind, a conundrum. On the one hand, there are those who come here that are total materialists, total naturalists. You don't believe in a spiritual reality. And yet you're willing to entertain this thing that people refer to as the alien phenomenon. And yet you resist looking at the alien phenomenon through spiritual eyes. You want these beings to be physical, natural, material beings from another planet. And what we're asking you is to entertain the possibility that, yes, the phenomenon is real, but why don't you try on for size the non-physical reality position? And you don't have to commit to any faith. John Keel, Jacques Vallée, they were there long before we did this conference. They have no spiritual commitments at all. And that is where they went to. Two of the pioneers in ufology concluded that the best explanation was a non-physical, at its heart, reality, and not interplanetary in that sense. So we're taking their work as credible ufologists. We're looking at ancient texts and motifs and wedding the two. And we find that it coheres fairly well. Now, what we're going to do today, and I believe I can keep this to an hour, is go through Genesis 6, make a few observations. There will be a portion of this that we dealt with the Zechariah Sitchin overview of the night before, but not too much of it. And I tried to cut some of the slides out of it as well. But the immediate topic is, as you read here on the screen, Genesis 6 and bloodline hybridization, sons of God, daughters of men, and the Nephilim. What the goal is today is to help you get a little familiarity. If you've never been exposed to Genesis 6, if you have, to start thinking about some of the questions that the passage raises, and there are a lot of them. I looked at this passage a lot and I still have questions. There are just some things that I wish were clear, and I will be honest with you and tell you what I think I can say with a fair degree of certainty and what I can't. So here's the passage. When humankind, in Hebrew it's ha-adam, Adam is the same word for the proper noun, proper name, Adam, and humankind, same word. When humankind began to multiply on the face of the ground or face of the earth, the daughters were born to them. So the human offspring in this passage are referred to as the daughters. The sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim, saw that the daughters of humankind, Banot Ha-Adam, were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in or with, you can translate the preposition either way, humanity, Ba-Adam, forever, for their flesh, and their days shall be 120 years. It's a limitation of lifespan, is what the verse 3 is talking about. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim, went into the daughters of humankind, again, the same term, Banot Ha-Adam, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, the warriors of renown. This is the classic biblical text relating to, again, the union of heaven and earth, as Dave put so well. My approach today is to ask some questions and to entertain some possible answers to them. Is there a relationship between this incident in Genesis 3, the serpent incident that Dave just alluded to? Were the sons of God the daughters of humanity, or daughters of men? Who were they, and what was the nature of their relationships? Is there a relationship between the sending of the great flood and these unions? Dave has already played our hand here. We think yes. Who were the Nephilim, and are they distinct from the sons of God? Does the word Nephilim mean giants? Did ancient people of the biblical world really believe in hybridized offspring? In other words, did they take the Genesis 6 story literally? How was the ancient idea, or the idea of giants after the flood, explained in ancient Jewish and biblical traditions? Were the biblical giants friend or foe of Israel, and does this help explain Israel's violent holy wars under Joshua? Those are the questions. So let's start with the first one. Genesis 3, this is the fall passage. Let's take a look at it as a backdrop to Genesis 6. And we all know the story. Again, Dave has sort of provided a nice segue here. We have something called the serpent, or the snake, with Eve in the Garden of Eden, where they have a conversation. And the serpent, the snake, gets her to eat of the forbidden fruit and introduces rebellion, sin, into the world. Of course, Adam is the one who gets ultimately blamed for it because, as Paul says, he sinned knowingly, whereas Eve was deceived. But after that happens, there are curses that are handed out. And in verse 13 here, this is Genesis chapter 3, we read, the Lord God said to the woman, what is this you have done? The woman replied, the serpent, the Hebrew is hanakash, the H with a dot under it is the technically proper Hebrew transliteration right here. CH with the K sound like Loch Ness. The Nakash duped me, and I ate. Then the Lord God said to the Nakash, because you did this, more cursed shall you be than all cattle and all the wild beasts. On your belly shall you crawl, and dirt shall you eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity, which just means hatred or some adversarial relationship, between you and the woman, and between your offspring, literally it says your seed, and her offspring, again, literally seed. Now the next line is interesting. It's a third masculine singular verb, and you can translate it, he will strike at your head, or you can say, it will strike at your head. And you shall strike at his or its heel. And the reason I do this is because some of you in the room will probably disagree on whether this verse points to a messianic prophecy, he meaning the ultimate seed, Jesus, versus the serpent. That's quite possible. Some Christians don't take this verse that way, but I'm not going to deal with that at all, but I thought I'd be fair to both views here. I have this, of course, in a different color because I want to highlight this idea of seed, and I want to talk about the Nakash a little bit here. If you come to the session where we talk about watchers and serpentine beings, we'll get into some more details about the nature of the curses and whatnot. But for our purposes, several observations are important. These are my views, and if you want to oppose me on them, great, but be armed, because I'm pretty well convinced here. I do not believe that the Nakash was a snake. The seed of the Nakash, I don't think, is Satan. The seed of the Nakash is not Satan, because the Nakash is Satan in later biblical tradition. In the Old Testament, the link between the Nakash, the serpent, and what we would know later as the devil is not actually made. You don't actually have that connection in the Old Testament. You do in the New and in intertestamental Jewish literature. The seed of the Nakash, I'm going to argue, is best understood as plural or collective in its immediate, that is Genesis, context, although the New Testament later particularizes the seed of the woman who would ultimately punish the Nakash as one person, namely Christ. However, the New Testament also pluralizes the seed as well. Let's start in with Nakash here and elaborate on each of those and explain them a little better. What does Nakash mean? It's a very common root. 3 letters in Hebrew, the N, actually the Nun, the Chet, and the Shin, Nakash, which functions as 3 things: a noun, a verb, or an adjective in the Hebrew Bible. Now the question is here, how should we understand it? Because if it's a noun, it has one meaning. If it's a verb, it has a different meaning. And an adjective is actually a third meaning. So if we're looking here, if we take Nakash in its normal noun meaning, the word would mean serpent. Entirely possible. But I've already told you I don't think that's what it is. If you take it as its verb meaning, the verb Nakash means to deceive or to divine. That means the practice of divination. Don't need to elaborate on that. So if you take it in its verbal sense, you would translate this as the deceiver or the diviner. Yeah, that can work, of course. If you take it as the normal adjective meaning, Nakash is something that shines. It's a shiny thing. And you could translate this term as the shining one. Now that's going to become important later on. I won't elaborate on it in here. But there are 2 other passages, namely Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, that also discuss the incident in the garden. And in both of those, you have a shining and also, I will argue, serpentine being. I think actually all 3 meanings are at play. This is a triple entendre, essentially. I think that the Nakash is essentially a serpentine, luminous being. I take it in its adjectival sense, the shining one. Again, a brilliant, shining, angelic, or divine being is cast out of Eden. Neither of these passages right here describe a snake. If you go here and here, you're going to talk about a shining being. In fact, we get our word Lucifer from Isaiah 14, where it says the being who is thrown out is actually named. His name in Hebrew is Hallel ben Shachar, which simply means the shining one, the son of the dawn. Okay, so you have this association. Again, we will deal with some other things in the other presentation. The issue here for our purposes today is who or what are the seed of the Nakash? There are 2 options. One, the Nakash had literal children who opposed humanity. We'll just call that the genetic relationship. I just made up the terms here. Second possibility is there are those individuals, divine or otherwise, like the Nakash. That is, they have evil intent toward the seed of the woman, that is humanity, and ultimately the Messiah. And these beings follow the original Nakash's example and purposes. By way of example, we use the expression, the hometown's favorite son, where this phrase means that the individual sort of represents the town. There's nothing literally genetic, but it's a representational relationship. So those are your two options. There's no biblical text that actually takes the first view. In other words, there's no text that has the Nakash, what we later think of as Satan, fathering anyone in a literal genetic, reproductive sense. Although his evil kin, in representing his deed and intent, the sons of God of Genesis 6, were thought to have literally fathered offspring. The guys in Genesis 6 do father literal offspring in Jewish theology. The serpent, the Nakash, does not. Now later, in post-biblical, after the biblical Jewish tradition, there were those who interpreted the Genesis 3 episode as actually having Satan fathering hybrids with Eve. You will read that in rabbinic tradition, which is much later than the biblical. This was actually the rabbinic answer, quote unquote, to the evil line of Cain, who were considered forerunners and progenitors of the daughters of men in Genesis 6. The women were evil, the rabbis taught, and the sons of God were very good. That's a very sexist view. But again, I'm not trying to tread on Orthodox rabbinism here or Orthodox Hasidim. But to be quite honest with you, that's a pretty sexist view. Don't know how else to put it. It was propped up to avoid the literal understanding that you actually had divine-human cohabitation. So the rabbis came up with this idea. Now, as a sidebar, you may have read Lawrence Gardner in his books on the bloodline of the Holy Grail. Gardner actually takes this view that Eve and the serpent cohabited together. So, as a sidebar here, isn't the serpent-Eve liaison a biblical idea? That's what Gardner says, is he a scholar? The short answer is no. And I don't like Gardner, I'll be very honest with you. My attitude towards Sitchin is one of, oh well, we disagree. And I had somebody ask me last night if they thought Zecharia Sitchin had some kind of sinister agenda. And I still don't think that. I really don't think that. I think it's an issue of competence. I do, however, think that Lawrence Gardner has an agenda. I think he has a very, very sinister agenda. And I'll give you an example of his scholarship from his book, Genesis of the Grail Kings, in this sidebar. This is from his book. I've scanned the page, so I'm not misquoting him. Page 128, he's talking about Eve and the line of Cain. And he says here, in the opening verse of Genesis 4, it is written that Hava, that's the Hebrew word for Eve, said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. Other variations are, I have gotten me a man with the Lord, and I have acquired a man from the Lord. The text then continues to say that this new man, Hava's first son, was Cain, better known by the phonetic translation Cain. Subsequently, Havad is said to, so on and so forth. What he does, here's his quotation of the verse, I have gotten a man from the Lord, or these variants. This leads you to think that he has actually quoted the verse. After all, he says, in the opening verse of Genesis 4, it's written. Well, here's the actual verse. The part in red is what Gardner quotes. You'll notice there's a whole lot that he leaves out in white. Here's the part that he gives you, the reader, assuming you won't look it up. And most readers don't look up the verses. It doesn't just say this, I have acquired a man with the Lord. You'll notice I have this in blue. This is the word Gardner translates as with. He not only deletes 2/3 of the verse for you, his readers, but he assumes, one, that the Lord is Satan, which is actually the heart of Gnosticism. Gardner is a Gnostic, plain and simple. He also assumes that this particle means with. Right there. Now the particle et in Hebrew can mean with, but the context determines that. And Gardner has kindly deleted the context for you. Here's what's missing in the yellow. Now Adam, v'ha'adam yada et Chava. Adam knew Eve, his wife, common euphemism for sex in the Old Testament, and she conceived, and she bore Cain. And she said, I have acquired a man, from the Lord. She didn't say, I have gotten a man with the Lord, like I had sex with the Lord. Gardner deletes this, which allows him to change this word to with. What he does, I think, is just plainly and blatantly deceptive. He cuts out 2/3 of the verse, assuming you won't look it up. And I have news for you. This isn't the only place he does it. Back to the seed of the Nakash. I think that there's biblical precedent that the seed of the Nakash is any being, divine or human, who acts in agreement with the Nakash's purposes. The hatred of humanity, specifically the bloodline that would lead to the Messiah. A couple examples. The phrase is actually used in the Old Testament, Isaiah 14:29. Rejoice not, all Philistia, because the staff of him that beat you is broken. This refers to an Assyrian victory over the Philistines. Don't be happy, Philistines, that the Assyrians are now losing their empire status. For from the stock of a snake, literally the root of the Nakash, there sprouts an asp. A flying seraph or serpent branches out from it. In other words, there's going to come along another demonic enemy that's going to be even worse than you are. John 8:44, you belong to your father, the devil. Now, Jesus is saying this. The people will use this as anti-Semitism in the New Testament. Okay, Jesus was a Jew, and he's not saying all Jews are this. He's targeting the Pharisees, the ones who would later crucify him. This is you got to read it in context. Matthew 3:7. When he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to where he was baptizing, he said to them, "You brood of vipers." There's a reason why this language is used. Jesus and whoever uses this kind of language is associating these people with the devil, with the Nakash. Your intent is evil. Your opposition to me is evil. The seed of the Nakash are broadly then evildoers who take measures to oppose Yahweh's plan for his people. Since humanity, Yahweh's ultimate deliverance was through a human seed, Son, the Messiah, the seed of the Nakash are adversaries to that plan. And that brings us to Genesis 6. So we already talked about this relationship between the two chapters. So just who were the sons of God and the daughters of humanity, the daughters of men, and what was the nature of their relationships? Daughters of humankind, it's pretty easy to identify in practice. Nobody disagrees with this. They're human beings, banot, daughters, ha'adam. The word Adam is one of the most common words for humanity in the entire Old Testament. It's a word used in the account of the creation of humanity. Let us make humankind, Adam, in our image. Identification of the sons of God, however, is controversial, but not among Hebrew and Semitic scholars. The sons of God, everyone who's professionally in Hebrew and Semitics knows that this phrase, sons of God, refers to divine beings, lesser gods, with respect to Yahweh, and not angels or humans. This idea that they're divine and not angels or humans is seen through several lines of evidence and the absurdity of the alternatives. Now, this might be new to some of you. If you did not hear me last night or have not looked through my website, yes, I am distinguishing the sons of God as a different class of heavenly being as opposed to angels. We can quibble about that. Divine and human probably be a better way to say it, so there's more agreement among us who do biblical studies here at the conference. So the point is kind of peripheral, but you get the idea. You have a divine-human cohabitation going on here. Sons of God, divine beings, lesser gods. The phrase takes two forms in Hebrew, B'nai Ha-Elohim or B'nai Elim. Elohim, often the proper word for God, but also means gods. Elim is the plural of El, which is the singular word for a god or God. A parallel is B'nai Elyon, sons of the Most High, in Psalm 82. Everywhere in the Hebrew Bible where these terms occur, the context tells us that divine beings are the referent and not humans. Here they are, and this is all of them. These are the places where the phrase occurs. Job 1:6 and 2:1. One day the sons of God presented themselves before the Lord, and the adversary, in Hebrew it's Hasatan, the Satan. Again, in the Old Testament, Satan was not a proper name. It just denoted the enemy of God. The Satan came along with them. Same phrase here in 2:1. So the sons of God come before the Lord, and Hasatan is along with them. The scene, of course, is in heaven, and they're going to decide the fate of Job. The context, again, dictates that these are divine beings. Job 38, 1-7. The Lord is conversing with Job, actually confronting him about his terrible difficulties, and God is trying to say, hey, look, I'm the one in charge. I don't have to answer to you, essentially. You need to trust me, but I don't have to answer to you. And he says to Job, he gives him a series of rhetorical questions. Okay, if you're so smart, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon? A whole series of questions. And then, describing creation, he says this. On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? This, of course, implies that the sons of God were in existence prior to the laying of the foundations of the earth in Genesis 1. We aren't told when they were created. We are told that they were created elsewhere, but we don't have a chronology. Psalm 29, Psalm of David. Ascribe to the Lord, O sons of God, O B'nai Elim. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. This psalm, if you were to study it, you'd find out it follows a Canaanite hymn in many ways. In that hymn, the sons of El are members of his pantheon. Psalm 89, we've talked about this already. For who in the skies can equal the Lord? Who can compare with the Lord among the sons of God? The B'nai Elim, a God greatly dreaded in the council of the holy ones. Besod Kedoshim. So the context is, again, something heavenly, non-earthly. Our classic verse, God, Elohim, stands in the divine assembly. Among the divine beings, among the Elohim, he pronounces judgment. The second one has to be plural because of the grammar. And then the same chapter, 82, you get down to verse 6, and he says to these Elohim that he's pronouncing judgment on, I had taken you for gods, Elohim, sons of the Most High, all of you, but you're going to die like men do. In other words, I'm going to take away your immortality. And by the way, Dave is correct. Immortality is the fundamental characteristic of a divine being, as opposed to a human. In Jewish texts like Enoch, that were written after the Old Testament but before the New, the sons of God are often called watchers. We're going to hold on to that thought, and we're going to go back to Genesis 6:1-4. We will go back to the watchers, but just so that you know that, and I could have skipped that because of Dave's presentation. But you go back here, and look how many times the writer wants to distinguish humankind and divine. Human, divine, human, divine. I mean, the language is very clear. You have one group breeding with another group. One is human, one is not. Now, I say this because I'm targeting here in this part of the session, I'm targeting those Christians who somehow just don't want to believe that their Bible, which they considered inspired and authoritative, actually has an episode in it where divine beings cohabit with human beings. It just can't, the text just can't mean what it says. Well, yeah, I think it does mean what it says. And you have a whole lot of precedent for it. Canaanite text, Ugaritic, Phoenician, Akkadian, you have the same kind of idea. To argue that the sons of God in the Hebrew Bible are not divine means you must do the following. You have to ignore the use of the phrase everywhere else in the Bible. You have to argue that the sons of the Most High are humans, which is hard to do since verses 6 and 7 call them Elohim and then they get sentenced to death like men. You realize you're going to die like men? You human beings, I sentence you to death to die like human beings. I mean, does that make any sense? It doesn't make any sense, but if you're divine, and if your sovereign says to you, you used to be in this realm, immortal, no longer, then it means something. You have to ignore all the comparative Semitic data on the subject. The two other views, most common, there are other variations, are the Sethite view, says the sons of God are the offspring of Seth, Adam's son. Dominant Christian view since Augustine. And the royal view, sons of God are dynastic rulers. This is what the rabbis usually favored. Now, all the other views ignore the data we've talked about because they just find this idea offensive. But this is how all Christian and Jewish interpreters took the story up until the 3rd century, the late 3rd century AD, just prior to the time of Augustine. In fact, the only one other than before Augustine who takes a non-literal view of Genesis 6 is Julius Africanus. Very almost contemporary. They overlapped a little bit with Augustine, but Augustine was the big guy. Sidebar, the Sethite view again says the sons of God are godly male from the line of Seth. The daughters of women are ungodly. Again, I think this is a little sexist. Aside from neglecting the evidence noted already, you have to cope with this. The Sethites are never identified as sons of God in the entire Old Testament. The view requires giving the Hebrew word Adam in verses 1 and 2 two entirely different meanings. You'd have to read it like this. When humankind, Adam, began to multiply on the face of the ground, daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of Seth, right, were fair, or the daughters of Cain it should be. But note Adam, you have to translate Adam as something other than humankind. It also forces its adherents to argue this way, that being of a particular lineage gave a person favor with God. Think about that. That's fairly offensive. That the only faithful people at the time were males from this line. The females, of course, weren't going to go to heaven. That the Sethites produced giant offspring. How could a human-human relationship produce giants? Doesn't make any sense. That despite the fact that all the names given in the Canaanite genealogies in Genesis 5 are found in the Sethite genealogy, the same chapter, the lines are different. This is a significant point. The genealogies overlap, so the lines are not different. You have to cope with that. And you also have to say that Peter and Jude, again, if you're a Christian who takes this Sethite view, you also have to believe that 2 New Testament writers got it wrong. So you have an error in your New Testament. For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus. This is what the Greek text says. Tartarus is the place that the watchers, actually in the Greek secular version, it's the Titans. Titans, watchers, Jewish, Greek interplay there. This is the place they were sentenced. They were sent to and imprisoned. The Titans were after they went down to earth and cohabited with human women in the secular Greek texts. If he didn't spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus and committed them to chains of deepest darkness to be kept until the judgment, and if he did not spare the ancient world, even though he saved Noah. So this contextualizes this. A herald of righteousness with 7 others when he brought a flood in the world of the ungodly. If God didn't spare them, then he goes on to say, why do you think you're going to get off the hook? Jude 6. The angels who did not keep their own place but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains and deepest darkness. Sounds just like Peter. For the judgment of the great day. Likewise, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which in the same manner as them indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural lusts, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Now here's the question. This word, in the same manner as them, does them refer back to the cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, or does it refer back to the angels? It's an important question, because if it refers back to the angels, he's linking the angelic sin to a sexual sin, and that is Genesis 6. He's taking a very literal view. And guess what the grammar tells us? Grammar tells us the answer is the angels due to the gender and number agreement. If you've ever had a foreign language, you know that pronouns need to agree in gender, number, and case with their antecedent. To tois is a masculine plural, and angels is masculine plural. Cities, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, is a grammatical feminine. They do not agree grammatically. So that tells you. So the rest of the question we're dealing with, what was the nature of their relationship? Well, it's obviously sexual, but there's more to it than that. This phrase, sons of God saw the daughters of humankind and they took wives. The word is lakach in Hebrew. It's not correct to argue that this language refers to forcible rape or relationships. And I'm going to use that truth to go in a certain direction here, so pay attention to this. The same phrasing, to take a wife, to lakach a wife, used elsewhere in the Old Testament of proper, respectable marriage, whether taking a wife for yourself or choosing one for someone else. They lived in a patriarchal culture where they would choose mates for their children. It's a respectable relationship. It is not forcible rape. It's consensual. Store that away. It's also likely, beside the consensual aspect, that the text conveys the idea that there were also ongoing before and after the flood. Genesis 6:4 says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humankind who bore children to them. This phrase, also afterward, referring to after the flood. The Hebrew verbs describing how the sons of God went in to the human wives, again another common sexual euphemism in biblical language, is in the imperfect form, which denotes uncompleted, ongoing action. A grammar would call it the frequentative use. The ensuing verb, how the women bore children as a result, is in a construction known as narrative sequence, meaning it carries the same action as the preceding verb. Why do I point this out? Because what this points to, there's an old question we're going to cover. How do you get giants after the flood? There are a variety of views for that. I'm going to suggest, we're going to go through the options, but I'm going to suggest to you that the grammar indicates that the reason you have giants after the flood is because the activity that created giants started again. The flood did not put it to a stop. The flood might have wiped out the product, the offspring, the Nephilim, but it didn't wipe out the sons of God, because they were created when Nephilim died. Enoch calls them watchers. I said last night they're like second generation watchers, and pardon the pun, like father, like son. You have the possibility of ongoing incidents. So we talked about chapters 3 and 6. We talked about the sons of God, the daughters of men. Is there a relationship between the sending of the great flood and these unions? Of course, I'm going to answer yes, and be consistent with Dave and other things I've said before. There is considerable controversy about this before, because the Genesis account seems to blame humanity. Genesis 6:5 says that God looked down and saw the wickedness of mankind, that every thought of the imagination of his heart was only evil continually. It seems to set the blame on humans, not the sons of God. Whereas Jewish traditions like Enoch clearly says the reason the flood was sent was because of the watchers, the sons of God. So why do the traditions disagree, or at least appear to disagree? Why does the Old Testament fault humans when the evil was initiated by the sons of God? Here's my suggested answer. And I'm still thinking about this, but the sexual transgressions crossing the boundary of heaven and earth in a grasp for divinity, they were voluntary. That means, down here, we'll go back to Jesus' statement here, giving in marriage. If you go back to Genesis 6, this idea of women voluntarily having relationships with divine beings and fathers voluntarily letting their daughters do this, giving them in marriage, is significant. Because if you're doing this voluntarily, if you're transgressing heaven and earth voluntarily, then you share the blame. Now Jesus adds this comment in Matthew 24:38. Matthew 24, by the way, is Jesus' longest sermon in the New Testament, and he's dealing with the end times. What shall be the signs of thy coming? The disciples asked him. He says, well, I'll give you a few. And one of the comments he has here is, for as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. Now, this phrase is very rare in the Bible. And if you go back to Noah's day and you read all the biblical material about Noah in Genesis, there's only one kind of marriage going on. And it's the sons of God and the daughters of men. Now, Guy hasn't said this to you, but he's thinking about next year having a prophetic theme. And if you were here for Dave's talk, there's probably some merit to considering that. He didn't bring up this verse, but Jesus says, hey, when I come back, it's going to be just like it was in the days of Noah, in the days before the flood. Sort of an ominous comment on his part. Next two outline questions. We've covered these subjects. The next two are, who are the Nephilim, and are they distinct from the sons of God, and does the word mean giants or fallen ones? Now, I do not believe, and you know this from last night, so I'm going to go through this fairly rapidly. I've cut some slides out. I don't believe the word means fallen ones in Hebrew. There's a problem with that, even though dictionaries will say that if you look them up. It's actually impossible for Nephilim in Hebrew to mean fallen ones. The reason is the spelling, the morphology, the shape of the word. To write fallen ones in Hebrew, you need to understand a little bit about the spelling to know why this is so. Here's how Nephilim is spelled in the Bible. Look at the letters. You don't have to be able to read Hebrew, but look at the shapes. This one is the same except for this little yod, this little mark here. When vowels were added later, the scribes who preserved the pronunciation took this form, the first spelling, and put these little dots underneath. That was how they added vowels, and the result was Nephilim. The problem with saying that this word means fallen ones is this. This is how you'd spell fallen ones in Hebrew. Nephilim. You'll notice that this does not correspond to this. This is the biblical word right here for Nephilim. This is the word for fallen ones. They are not the same. The spelling tells you that this word, Nephilim, does not mean fallen ones. If someone were to argue, well, and this is common in the church, to get away from a literal interpretation, and by the way, one of the audience asked me on the first day about a comment I made about the church that I actually mentioned on Coast to Coast. And it's not that I was in a bad mood, I really mean this. I think that the people who you would think on the surface are the most interested, or should be the most interested in the supernatural, seem to be the least, because the church seems to have strip mined the supernatural out of the Bible. And I don't use the word strip mine lightly. I think that is the case. It's called demythologizing things. And one of the best ways to do this, if you're interested in demythologizing the Bible, is to say, well, Nephilim means those who fall down or fall upon an enemy like a warrior. That doesn't work either. Because if in Hebrew you wanted to say that, you'd spell it this way. No Nephilim. The pointing here, the dots, is different. How do we know, though, that this pointing is correct, that it preserves the original ancient spelling and ancient pronunciation? It's proven by this. This spelling occurs in Numbers 13:33. This little letter here is what the ancient Hebrews, before there were vowels, used to denote the I sound. You know, we still kind of do this today between I and Y, and it does double duty as a consonant and a vowel. This spelling is the ancient way of telling us that this is how you say the word Nephilim, and therefore it cannot mean fallen ones. It proves that it means something else. I think the best possibility, there's one other. What you need is a root word that has the middle I letter as the base of Nephilim. That's the only way you can account for the form. In Aramaic, there is such a word. It was common to bring Aramaic words into the Bible because when the Bible was finalized, put in its final form, the Hebrew scribes were living in Babylon, and that was the language they spoke. They spoke Aramaic. The Hebrew authors even borrowed the way they shaped the letters from Aramaic in Babylon. This word is Nephilah, and it means giant. Just what, frankly, we would expect. Sidebar, can the Nephilim be equated with the biblical sons of God? The answer is no, and that question takes us to the next major issue. Did ancient people of the biblical world really believe this? Did they really take this literally? Prior to the end of the 2nd century, again, all Jewish and Christian texts and commentaries that refer to the passage take it literally, that you have the offspring as giants. They are a hybrid union of divine human cohabitation. It is all literal. That means that the sons of God are not the Nephilim. They're separate groups. We've seen how the language distinguished, the context contrasts divine and human. The text very clearly tells us that the Nephilim were not divine. They were called mighty men of renown. This phrase is Gibborim. It's used of regular human men elsewhere in the Old Testament. And if they're not divine beings, if the Nephilim aren't divine, then they are not the sons of God by definition. The wider biblical context shows that the Nephilim were considered to be people, okay, humans. In other words, not gods, okay? Referring to the giant Arba, who was from the Anakim, a giant clan who were related to the Nephilim. Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. Deuteronomy 2:9, the Amim were, like the Anakim, the Anakites, they are counted as Rephaim. This is a giant clan in the Old Testament. A people, normal word for people, human beings in the Old Testament. Other ancient texts. We're going to limit this to Enoch for the most part. Enoch distinguishes them. You have the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after the women, chose them wives. Again, they beget us children. They choose the women. The women have children. What kind of children did they have? Well, next chapter in Enoch. The angels from the last chapter, together with human women, took themselves wives. The wives became pregnant and they bare great giants, clearly distinguishing the sons of heaven from the Nephilim. Same thing here. As for the women, they gave birth to giants. I mention all this because, again, it's common. Zechariah Sitchin is the best example. For some reason, again, I know the reason, he wants to merge the groups. He wants to have the Nephilim be the sons of God. Why? Because he wants Nephilim to mean those who came down from heaven. And he wants that because he wants them to be aliens. He wants them to be the Anunnaki aliens. The Book of the Giants, another text. Ancient, this is fragmentary text. This is from Qumran. By the way, when you read Dead Sea Scroll stuff, 1Q just means Cave 1 from Qumran, lines 23-24. Cave 4 from Qumran, so on and so forth. This text is sort of the backdrop, the basis, the foundation for part of what would eventually be found in Enoch. And again, this fragment mentions Azazel, who was the lead watcher, and the watchers, along with the Gibborim, the mighty men of Genesis 6. Another fragment mentions Enoch, and then says, here's what the Book of the Giants says in this fragmentary portion. Let it be known to you that, and the rest of the line is gone, we don't have it. Your deeds and those of your wives, again it's gone, there's a gap here. Those, ellipsis, sons and wives of, gone, mentions fornication on the earth, accusing you regarding the deeds of your sons, the corruption which you have committed on it. Again, the ends of the line, the end of the scroll is lost until the coming of Raphael. Now, what this refers to, if you went back to the book of Enoch, Raphael is the one who is sent, as Dave mentioned before, that the watchers actually have to be informed by God what's going to happen to them. Raphael is the one who gets sent back to carry out part of their punishment. Enoch is told what's going to happen. It tells them what's going to happen to them. Raphael is part of the archangel group that carries the punishment out. So it's a reference again to this episode. Book of Jubilees, this is very clear. You have days in the days of the angels of the Lord who were called watchers, came down upon earth in order to teach the sons of men and perform judgment and uprightness on the earth. It makes it sound good. And if you read Jubilees, that's a little different because the watchers come down and, we're just going to help. But they wind up becoming corrupted. In this, verse 22, 7 lines later, the watchers, the ones who sinned with the daughters of men, began to mingle themselves with the daughters of men so that they might be polluted. Okay, so it's viewed as a negative thing. Another Qumran fragment mentions the Gibborim, who are born to the angels, separate groups, again. Another text, Genesis Apocryphon. This is a Dead Sea Scroll text. It's sort of the rest of the story of the first 15 chapters of Genesis. The text reads, Behold, I considered in my heart that this conception was from the watchers and from the holy ones. Now with respect to the Nephilim, and the rest of the line's missing, so we don't know what was going to be said about the Nephilim. But again, they're the offspring. This is actually an interesting text. If you weren't here last night, I'll let you know what this is dealing with. This deals with a conversation between Lamech, who was the father of Noah, and his wife, Bathanosh, where he suspects that the child she's carrying, who's going to be Noah, is actually an offspring of the watchers. And he confronts her. He says, I want to know if that's my kid. And she says, well, you better believe it's your kid. And it's kind of funny. She asks, don't you remember the other night when I'm gonna... And he doesn't buy it. The funny thing is he doesn't buy it. And in the end of the text, I didn't show this last night, she gets frustrated with him. I mean, she's denying it left and right. And she says, okay, go ask Enoch. He knows all about this stuff. Like he's going to be able to prove it somehow. But it's kind of an interesting text again. They took it literally. They took the Genesis incident literally. No, yeah, maybe he was clairvoyant. How was the idea of the giants after the flood explained in Jewish and biblical traditions? So we know they took it literally, and that presented sort of a problem with this line in Genesis about there being giants, Nephilim on the earth in those days and after. Those two little words just vexed people a lot. They were the mighty ones, the Gibborim from ancient times, the men of renown. Option one. Well, you could argue some giants must have just survived. As we'll see shortly, there are a number of references to giants in the Old Testament after the flood, especially during the wars of Joshua. Speculation that this explained it, that you just had giants survive, began, though, with references to this biblical character, Nimrod, in Genesis 10. Cush begat Nimrod, who was the first man of might. He was the first Gibbor on the earth. He was a mighty hunter, the Gibbor Tzayid, by the grace of the Lord, hence the saying, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter, by the grace of the Lord. The mainstays of his kingdom were Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar, or of course Sumer. Since Genesis 6:4 links the Nephilim and the Gibborim, and the Nephilim were giants, the text labels the giants Gibborim. So the assumption is that Nimrod, if he's a Gibbor, singular, this is the plural, Nimrod must have been a giant. And in fact, the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation done in the intertestamental period of the Hebrew Old Testament, the people who translated, I guess it's a singular person, whoever did Genesis, translated all three occurrences of Gibbor about Nimrod in that section, that Genesis 10 section. The translator used the word gigas, which means giant. So he thought that Nimrod was probably a giant. Now there's a problem. Nimrod was related to Noah. He is in Noah's genealogical line. So if you're going to have Nimrod be a giant, then here we're back to the old Genesis Apocryphon question. Well, was Noah a giant? Some rabbis taught that because of this question, how do we get giants after the flood? They taught that Noah was a giant. But there's a problem with that. The problem with Noah being a giant is that Genesis 6:9 says Noah was perfect in his generations. Jewish texts outside the Bible do not allow, though, Noah as a giant. There are other Jewish texts that just flatly deny that Noah could be a giant. We've already seen the Genesis Apocryphon where Lamech and his wife are arguing about whose kid is it. And that text plainly has his wife saying, no way. Okay, this is your kid. I have nothing to do with the watchers. The book of Enoch denies that Noah is a giant. Gentile, non-Jewish writers, though, did preserve that tradition. They did favor that view, that Noah and Nimrod were giants. Alexander Polyhistor's book on the Jews, this is a book a Gentile was writing about Jewish people and Jewish tradition, implies that Noah was a giant, has the knowledge given by the angels and passed on by the giants. Again, Dave talked about the watchers dispensing knowledge. He also viewed the knowledge as a good thing, contrary to the Jewish view. And here's a fundamental difference. I had a person in the audience ask me a couple hours ago about Gnosticism. One of the things, specifically about the Nag Hammadi texts, which are the basis for Gnosticism. On the one hand, while it's true that the Nag Hammadi texts and our texts, our manuscripts of the New Testament, both date back to roughly the same time, 2nd, 3rd century. While that's true, there are two problems with saying that Gnosticism is the truth as opposed to New Testament Orthodox. Actually, there's a lot more problems with it, but I'll pick two. One is that portions of the New Testament are quoted by the Church Fathers before the 3rd century, and before the 2nd century even. So the material can be argued as older, but I don't really like chronological arguments. The big one for me is that Judaism consistently believed and contended and included divine plurality. Now, I know that sounds strange. Judaism took a very literal view of this and specifically counted the knowledge given by the Watchers as evil, specifically said the Nephilim were evil. The only people who said they were good guys were the non-Jews. In other words, Gnostic theology departs from the Jewish Christian stream of history. It is a departure. It is an aberration. It is, I would say, not an invention, but it is, I'll say this, it's Watcher theology. It's pro-Watcher theology. Okay, that is what Gnosticism is. That's my big problem with it. Next reference, Alexander was very anti-Egyptian, and for some reason he might have wanted to connect the knowledge of the Watchers with Babylon. And Alexander and other Jewish writers have Abraham as the recipients of Nimrod's knowledge. So the Gentile sources, and there aren't many of them, view it as a good thing. Now, back to Noah. If he can't be viewed as a giant in Jewish tradition, then there's no genetic link between the original sons of God and the Nephilim. It would seem that your only alternatives are these two. The flood wasn't global but localized. It wasn't universal. And so the giants did survive without respect to being related to Noah. Some of them were just missed. Although the biblical text seems pretty clear that only Noah and his immediate family survived, but you could argue this, and there were a number of Jews who did. You could also argue that the sons of God continued the genetic pollution of humanity. In other words, the recurring activity of the Watchers. You could argue for that. Again, there are obstacles with each alternative. The local flood view has been well articulated, but a truly global flood cannot be ruled out of the biblical text. And I mentioned last night that I do prefer a catastrophist model. I just think catastrophism explains a lot on a global scale. You could, though, cheat. You could have both a global and local flood event in simultaneity. How do you do that? Well, here's how you cheat. You could say, well, originally, the earth was Pangea, one landmass, so that the actual water doesn't necessarily have to cover the globe. It only covers part of the globe, but yet still part of the earth. And then the continents divide, continental drift. And that's why you have a collective memory of the flood among all civilizations. So you actually have a global, a flood that covers the whole landmass, but not over the entire globe. So you could cheat. I don't know if you want to cheat, but you could. You also have a problem with the repeat transgression. I'll be honest with you. I favor this view, but Numbers 13 might be a problem with it, and this is something I still need to think through. Very plainly says, we saw the Nephilim. Now watch this. Here's one spelling, right here, with a middle letter. And here's the other one. We saw the Nephilim, ha-Nephilim there. The Anakites are from the Nephilim. This phrase, from the Nephilim, is min ha-Nephilim. You'll notice there's no yod here. You have the same word spelled two different ways. I think the reason why this is done here is because this is the way it's spelled in Genesis 6. The writer wants to link these Nephilim after the flood with the ones before the flood. And if that's the case, if the Anakim came from, in other words, were related to the Nephilim from before the flood, you don't need continuing activity. You don't need the continual cohabitation. You have a genetic relationship intact, so to speak. Now finally, biblical giants, friend or foe of Israel, were they? Do you see these in the Bible? We've already hinted at, of course, yes you do. And does it help explain Israel's violent holy wars under Joshua? I want to say this. Now in Dave's talk, he, rather obliquely because it wasn't his topic, But I think he made it somewhat clear that in a biblical mindset, and I will expand it and say in a Jewish mindset, not in a Gentile mindset, but in an ancient Jewish mindset, you have two clear lines. You have those who are of the seed of the Nakash. Okay, you have those who are the seed of the sons of God. There could be a genetic relationship there. There is at least a representational relationship there. Those are the evil ones. And then on the other side, you have those who would follow, again, the God of Israel. Out of the God of Israel, out of Israel comes the Messianic line. You have a consistent friction and controversy and enmity and adversarial relationship between the Watcher line and their beliefs and their teachings and their theology and the Israelite equivalent of all those things. With that as a backdrop, look at what some of the things the Old Testament actually says in relation to this issue. Deuteronomy 32 is a really interesting verse. When the Most High, God of Israel, gave the nations their inheritance, their nakal, when he divided up all of mankind, when did that happen? Tower of Babel. Okay, when he divided up all of mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Now, if you look this up in almost any English Bible ever printed, this phrase will not be there. It will say according to the number of the sons of Israel. But the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls read the sons of God. What this means is that when God decides, okay, this is after the flood, when the flood took care of the problem, after the flood, God commanded, gave them the same command that was pre-flood, said, go out, be fruitful and multiply, have a wonderful time, be my representatives, fill the earth, and what do? They turn around and we say, well, we have a better idea. We're going to build a tower here. We're going to build a city and a tower. We're going to make a name for ourselves. We're going to make ourselves world-renowned. We're going to stay right here and accomplish that end. In fact, we're going to use the high technology that has been at our disposal. And where do we get that? Enoch tells us, the sons of God, the Watchers. We think this is really cool. If someone came up to you, essentially a Watcher, and said, hey, you want to know what makes the universe tick? You want to know how to use the material world to build things and learn things? We know that. We can tell you. And it's only coming at a small price. The small price being what Enoch says they did, second generation Watchers did. They forced the people to sacrifice to them as gods. Worship us, and we will lay the universe at your feet, because then you can be like us. You'll know what we know. Gnosis, knowledge. Gnosticism is nothing more than Watcher theology. Beware of it. But God decides, okay, you want to do that? Fine. You want to worship these flunkies? You want to worship these divine underlings? Go ahead. In fact, I'm going to divide up the earth according to the number of the sons of God, and that means that each geographical region gets to be ruled by them, by one of them or several of them, however it works out numerically. Dave would probably know, he'd probably have some equation for it. However that works out, every place on the earth, you don't want to follow me, you're going to serve them. I'm going to give you what you want. And I'm going to start over. For the Lord's portion, kalak, is a noun related to nakal, is his people. Jacob is his allotted inheritance, his nachalat. Nakal, nachalat, it's their word plays here. God says, I'm going to start over. And what does he do in the very next chapter after the Tower of Babel episode, Genesis 12? He calls Abraham and says, come here, Abraham, I'm going to make of you a great nation. I'm going to start over. And the whole rest of the Old Testament, the story is the descendants of Abraham against all the other peoples. Israel versus the nation. Yahweh versus the gods. That's the Old Testament. And if you miss that, you understand a truckload of what's going on in the Old Testament. Now, Deuteronomy 4 is a parallel passage. Moses is rehearsing this, speaking this. When you look up to the sky and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the heavenly array, the heavenly host, do not be enticed into bowing down to them. Moses is speaking to Israelites now. Yahweh's portion, Yahweh's people. Don't you dare worship them. Do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshiping things the Lord your God has apportioned. There's the word again, kalak. That the Lord appointed them. He appointed the sun, moon, and stars to all the nations under heaven. But as for you, the Lord took you and brought you out of the fiery furnace out of Egypt to be the people of his inheritance, as you now are. He's saying, look, remember this episode when God divided up the nations, put them under the authority of the watchers, the sons of God, said, I'm going to give you what you want, but Israel is my own. And Moses tells the Israelites, don't you dare worship them, because you belong to Yahweh. They belong to the watchers. It is a cosmic and earthly conflict. Deuteronomy 29. All the nations will ask, why has the Lord done this to this land? What happens if we disobey and things go bad? Why is his fierce burning anger? And the answer will be, it's because this people, the Israelites again in context, abandoned the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, the covenant he made with them when he brought them out of Egypt. They went off and worshipped other gods and bowed down to them, gods they did not know, gods he, Yahweh, had allotted. There's that word again, kalak. Gods that Yahweh had allotted to them. Again, God deliberately allotted the fallen gods to the nations to distance himself from them and place them under the control of the fallen Elohim. What you have here, this is the Old Testament rationale and explanation for why the other nations have their pantheons. It's because God sentenced them to that status, that position. It was a punishment. You don't want to obey me? Fine. You want to worship these flunkies? Fine. We'll see how you like it. That's why the rest of the Old Testament is, if you want to be in right relationship to God, you have to go through Israel. That's why Israel is called a kingdom of priests. What does a priest do? They're intermediaries. They're mediators. You had to be in the nation. It's also why, just rabbit trailing a little bit here, there are some obscure references in the Old Testament to this idea of divine territoriality, that the nations are under the rule of territorial beings, the fallen gods of Genesis 6. The episode with Naaman and Elisha, you might be familiar with it. If you're not, there was a guy from Syria named Naaman. He had leprosy. He couldn't get healed from it, couldn't get cured. He has a little servant girl who was a slave brought over from the Israelites after some war. And she says, the little girl walks up to the king, and the little servant says, well, if you got this problem, why don't you just go over to Israel and go talk to Elisha? He'll heal you. And he goes, well, okay, might as well try that. He goes over, and Elisha does heal him, and he wants to pay the prophet out of gratitude. And Elisha won't take anything, and then he asks a question. It's so obscure. But he says, okay, if you won't take anything for payment, is it okay if I take some bags of dirt back with me to my country? Elisha says, okay, that'd be all right. And Naaman says, no, I'm doing this because when I have to go into the temple of my God, Ramon, I want to be able to spread the dirt on the ground, and so it'll be okay with Yahweh. He knows that in my heart I'm not really worshiping that God. I want to worship him. Why would he ask for dirt? Because it's holy ground. He wants to take dirt from Israel back to his country. This was their mentality. It's a turf war. The whole rest of the Old Testament. Abraham runs into giants. He runs into the Rephaim, the Zuzim, the Amim, the Horites. You'll find out later in verses, these are all giant clans. What's really interesting about this list, some of the terms, when God makes a covenant with Abraham, again, this is God's portion. He makes a covenant in Genesis 15, and he says, I'm going to give you, Israel, the descendants of Abraham, the Israelites, I'm going to give you the land that's now currently owned by these people, Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, all the ites of the Old Testament. And then there's this phrase, this word, Rephaim. What's really odd about this, you'll notice, again, you don't have to read Hebrew, but watch this. You see this little letter here, and this one, the ones in yellow? You notice how all the words end with that little yod. It's called in grammar the gentilic ending. These are people group names. This one does not end with that. People groups, God says, you're going to, in the future, disinherit certain people groups in the land. However, there's going to be one group that doesn't live in just one place. These guys. Rephaim refers to essentially a population not localized in one area. These are your enemies as well. Rephaim were the giants. Now, if you look at the holy wars of Joshua, here's the land, the Holy Land. Joshua crosses the Jordan, goes to Jericho right here. It's a good military strategy. If you control the center, you can essentially cut off cooperation from the north and south end. So God specifically tells Joshua, you get this place first, then you go up north, you go south. Now what I want to show you is these places are going to have geographic names and certain cities. Certain of these cities and certain of these regions, south, north, and middle, were places that God said to Joshua, you go in there and you karem them. Karem means to place under the ban. That means you go in and annihilate everything that lives and breathes. In some cases, even the animals. That didn't happen often. But there are a few occasions when Joshua is told, when you go in there, you leave nothing alive. And what I'm suggesting, if you actually observe the places where that happens, where he's told to do that, the places happen to overlap with places that were populated by, you guessed it, giants. Bashan is going to be an important place to the north of the Sea of Galilee. If you look at Deuteronomy 2, he says, don't go in there and harass the Moabites or provoke them to war, because I won't give you any of their land as a possession. I have assigned Ar as a possession of the descendants of Lot, who was Abraham's relative. It was formerly inhabited by the Amim, a people great and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. And these were the Anakim of Numbers 13, the giants. Like the Anakites, they're counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites called them Amim. Now, in Hebrew, Amim means frightful ones, scary ones. This passage identifies the Anakim and Amim as giants. And if we keep reading, you come across a group called the Zamzumim, which are related. Another reference, the Horim, the Horites, who dwelt in Seir. We're going to see on the map where these places are in a minute. Okay, we're going to give you this land as a possession. It says the children of Esau, in fact, they've already done the deed. He goes in Deuteronomy 2, continuing on, he says, you will then be close to the Ammonites, don't harass them or start a fight with them, for I will not give any part of the land of the Ammonites to you as a possession. That goes to Lot. It too is counted as Rephaim country. It was formerly inhabited by Rephaim, whom the Ammonites call the Zamzumim. So this is a giant clan. And again, linking them to the Anakim, the Anakites. The Lord wiped them out so that the Ammonites dispossessed them and settled in their place, as he did for the descendants of Esau who lived in Seir. Also to the Avim. This is really interesting. It only shows up one time. Avim in Hebrew means serpents. It could be serpent worshippers or serpentine something, but they're a clan. Possibly descendants of the serpent, descendants of the Nakash. There could be a linkage. Gaza is a Philistine city. Remember Goliath? Okay, he was a Philistine. The Caphtorim, oh, here we go with Dave's presentation again. The Caphtorim come from Crete. Continue on with Deuteronomy 2. Sihon, the Amorite, the king of Heshbon, is specifically targeted. They send messengers in, solicit for peace, and God's already told them it's not going to happen. You go in and wipe them out. The king of Heshbon refused to let us pass through because the Lord had stiffened his will and hardened his heart. God says, get up, begin the occupation, take possession of the land. Now, who were these people? Sihon and Og were kings over the same people, over the Amorites. Og lived in Bashan. Bashan is the larger geographical region for this place, Ashtaroth. We made our way up the road toward Bashan. The King Og of Bashan with all his men took the field against us at Edrei. Edrei and Ashtaroth are two cities mentioned in Ugaritic texts with this place, but Ugaritic spelled Bashan differently than the Hebrews did. Instead of B-S-H-N, Bashan, they spelled it B-T-H-N. The sh and the th sound in the dialects were the same, but the spellings were different. It's a dialectical difference. Guess what Bathan means in Ugaritic? Serpent. This is the place of the serpent. This was a scary place to the Israelites. And they're commanded, you go in there and you get the job done. Sihon, the king of the Amorites who lived in Heshbon, Og of Bashan, they go in and conquer them. Who was Og down here? Only King Og of Bashan was left of the remaining Rephaim. His bedstead, an iron bedstead, is now in Rabbah of the Ammonites. It is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide by the standard cubit. That is roughly 13 or 14 feet long. He is from the Rephaim. He was a descendant of the giants. Other places put to the Kerem, Joshua 10, where you have different people groups mentioned. The Perizzites, they go into the territory of the Perizzites and the Rephaim, which is located in the hill country of the Rephaim. Here we have a reference to Arba, the father of the Anakim. The place is Kiriath Arba, also called Hebron. That's a place that was put under the ban. They went up to the Negev and came to Hebron, where there lived Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the Anakim. Okay. The Anakim, part of the Nephilim. Joshua went in, wiped out the Anakim. There's Hebron, Davir, Anab. All these cities, Joshua proscribed them. He put them under the ban. One more example, David defeating the Philistines. The Philistines, at the famous David and Goliath confrontation, the Philistines came and spread out over the valley of the Rephaim. That was where they set their camp. That was their turf. Joshua 15:8. Then the boundary, what's this valley? What's the valley of the Rephaim? The boundary ascended into the valley, which is the Hebrew word Geh, of Beth Hinnom, the Geh of Beth Hinnom, along the southern flank of the Jebusites, that is Jerusalem. So it's very close to Jerusalem. The boundary then ran up the top of the hill which flanks the valley of Hinnom, Geh Hinnom, on the west, at the northern end of the valley of the Rephaim. And where is that? The Hinnom Valley is a deep, narrow ravine located in Jerusalem, running south from the Jaffa Gate, so on and so forth. The term comes from son of Hinnom, the Hinnom Valley. In Hebrew, it is the Gehinnom. When translated into Greek, it is Gehenna, from which the word and concept of hell originated. The point is that the valley of the Rephaim was essentially, to the Israelite, hell. This is where the descendants of the Nephilim, the descendants of the Nakash, the seed of the Nakash, live. And in the Old Testament, you have nothing more than a series of episodes. Once Yahweh's portion is redeemed from Egypt and told to go into the land, their first job is to go directly in confrontation with the seed of the Watchers. The Old Testament is a cosmic turf war. Okay, it's not just random, it's not just purposeless. There is a deliberate opposition between one line and another line. It goes all the way back to Genesis 6, it goes all the way back to Genesis 3. And again, hopefully you heard Dave's presentation, because all of these areas, again, are related to giantism, and there are connections with the area of Tyre, the Philistine strongholds, Crete, all these things. Now, when we get to the Serpentine presentation, you'll see what the Tyre connection is. because that's Ezekiel 28, where a divine being, again, is expelled from the garden. Same story, but there's a connection with Tyre, or as Dave would say, Sidon, okay, Sidonia. That's what we have for now, and I'm all done. Guy wants to hold questions. Okay. Okay, we're done.
Thank you.
Mhm.